Hi, I'm Stephen Betts. You're listening to Scholars and Saints. Today on Scholars and Saints, we're talking about early Latter-day Saints and secularism. But what is secularism? Peter Coviello and Kathleen Flake join me to talk about how secularism is really never separate from religion. They're two sides of the same coin. As it turns out, Mormonism's unique ways of thinking about race, sex, and the body might just reveal interesting ways of thinking about the effects of secularism and give us new tools to analyze it. I'm pleased to welcome Peter Coviello here today. We're talking about his recent book, Make Yourselves Gods, Mormons and the Unfinished Business of American Secularism. Dr. Coviello is professor of English at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Thanks for joining us today, Pete.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
We're also joined by guest co-host Kathleen Flake, professor of Mormon Studies at the University of Virginia. Thanks for joining us, Kathleen.
Pleasure to be here.
So, Pete, Make Yourselves Gods is unlike really anything we've seen in Mormon studies before. It's a very theory-driven book, which of course is itself unusual for books about Mormonism. And it retells the familiar story of the Latter-day Saint progress towards Americanization, we could say, as a way of revealing the nature of secularism. And I think even more importantly, the ways that secular presumptions undergird the ways that we talk about secularism, which is part of a school of thought called post-secular critique, a school of thought that you're a part of. And these presumptions make that kind of critique difficult because that critique can be structured by those presumptions. And you argue that the Mormon story gives us tools, or a critical grammar, you call it, to critique the assumptions of secularism. So we're going to get into all of that and we're going to break it down. But before we dive into Make Yourselves Gods, I'm curious why you chose Mormonism as this exemplar to study secularism.
Well, Stephen, that's a fantastically fair question because in a lot of ways I have no rightful business doing so. As you know, I'm not a religious historian and I'm not a scholar of Mormonism and I'm not a Mormon. But I'm in certain ways as surprised as anyone to have found myself so sort of engaged and kind of enraptured by this archive as I was. The short way of telling the story is that I'm a 19th century Americanist and I specialize in 19th century American literature and wrote a book a little while ago. And I also do queer theory, and that's really where my intellectual education began, 19th century American literature and queer theory. And I was trying to write a book about what sexuality was or could be imagined as before the moment when hetero and homosexuality sort of became like the common currency of how we understand sexuality and how we understand coding of the body in the later 19th century. And I was like, all right, what is the mid-19th century thing about that? And it occurred to me while I was doing that, you probably oughtn't to write a book about sexuality in the American 19th century and not think at all about one of the tremendous sex scandals of the century, which is, of course, the scandal of Mormon polygamy. And so I decided to write a chapter about Joseph Smith. I should say I was gently prodded in this many years ago by a then quite young man who some of you guys may know named Jared Hickman, who was unbelievably an undergraduate of mine at Bowdoin College. And he wrote, it will not surprise you to learn, a bedazzling undergraduate thesis. And he suggested to me very gently, as I've been teaching him Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson and a variety of other figures in the 19th century, he's just like, I think Joseph Smith may have an interesting place in your canon. And he gave me a book of Joseph Smith's, and so I finally turned to it. And I found just far more than I was prepared for. And indeed, than I thought that I had the conceptual resources for in the first book. When I was thinking of a lot of people, in the first book, I thought a lot about like people who imagine the body and its capacities for pleasure in ways that would not answer to the taxonomies of sexual being that would arrive later in the century. And Smith fit into that archive splendidly with his vision of the divinizing body. And I just sort of began to think about that. And it proved a lot larger than a chapter. And that precipitated me into trying to think about secularism and trying to bring the unruly and to me very energizing field of post-secular studies into conversation with something like queer theory as it would play out in the 19th century. So that's, I guess, where it started. And that took me on a, like, I don't know, 6-7 year detour into the work of the book.
I find it humorous to hear you talk about this as a detour, particularly in your mastery of post-secular theory. So would you characterize yourself as a post-secular theorist? Is that the ambition here?
Oh dear, I don't know. No, not really. I think Kathleen can speak to this very well. It's really more a desire to be a part of an intellectual conversation that you find vitalizing. When I was young, queer theory did that to me in a way I cannot describe sufficiently. It was an absolutely electrifying, world-revising, self-revising way of understanding culture and its interface with art objects and with literature. And post-secular critique, as it arrived to me 10 years ago or so, had the same effect of inviting me to do the hard work of unlearning some of the categories that I had anchored my own thinking in. Talal Asad was a tremendous revelation to me. I think one of the great readers of Foucault, who's been important to me for so long. Katie Lofton, who you guys know, John Modern, who would become a dear friend of mine and just one of the most challenging and inviting thinkers I know. Just wanting to be a part of that critical conversation inspired a lot of this, and the Mormon story seemed to me a particularly fruitful way of entering that conversation in the terms that I wanted to, which was bringing something like queer studies and the critique of empire into post-secular studies.
I'm glad that you brought up Jared Hickman just a few moments ago. First of all, I love Jared Hickman's work, but Jared Hickman's work plays a large, a pretty central role in the work, as I take it, that you're doing in this book. And this is evident, I assume this was intentional, in the title itself, right? Make yourselves gods, the unfinished business of American secularism. There are a couple of things here, right? Make yourselves gods is, of course, a reference to a late sermon by Joseph Smith, in which he's expounding on the sort of doctrine of deification, right? But at the same time, this also seems to be a reference to quotation in a really powerful quotation in Hickman's work, where he talks about secularism and empire as kind of the complacent divinization of Anglo-European peoples, right?
Yeah, a beautiful, trenchant, killing phrase in Hickman's work. Becoming secular registers the complacent divinization of Euro-Christians in the ascendancy in the globe. That's a beautiful turn of Jared. I will say that the title of the book predates Jared's book, but of course it doesn't predate conversation with Jared, because we edited a volume of American literature together, and his thinking has just been so electrifying and so challenging to me that sort of catching up with it was a lot of the intellectual labor of the book. And as I got further along in trying to think through the problems of the divinizing body in Smith, along with Mormon's entanglement in the enterprise of empire, Jared's work was right there for me. Was just right there for me, also leading me to think with other people, Sylvia Winter among them, Hortense Spillers, who's been so important to me. So I can't, again, as I say, I think in the acknowledgements, there's no imagining this book in any way at all without not only Jared's scholarship, but his conversation, his sort of clarification of what the stakes of such a project might be.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, the other side of the title itself, this idea of secularism and its unfinished business is kind of this visual metaphor, for the kinds of work that secularism does in culture, and the kinds of work that I take it to do in this book is it's always creating a frontier for itself to conquer and to redeem.
Dear, that's beautifully said. That's beautiful. That's absolutely beautiful. It comes from, it's a phrase stolen from Lauren Berlant, The Unfinished Business of American Sentimentality, which will get her to a phrase like cruel optimism, like something that's always producing an outside that it then promises to redeem in some ever accumulating future moment. Something that Berlant critic named Sarah Ahmed, Jesbir Puar, and indeed John Modern help you think about as the recursive logic of secularism. What it now excludes, one day it will later enfold and aggrandize itself by further enfolding. It's sort of the cruelly optimistic promise of ever more inclusiveness that depends on, in fact, a current moment of exclusion. Assad, I think, and Sabah Mahmood have wonderful, attentive grammars to the way this logic works.
Yeah, and I think one of the difficult things about secularism as, we could say, loosely defined entity or ideology or set of ideologies is indeed the attempt to define what it is, because as you note in the book, it always exceeds our ability to put it into language because of how totalizing it is in our lives.
Yeah, I will say that I think is beautifully said. What I would say is that, as I mentioned in the book, it's a difficult conceptual formulation to get beneath, in part because, as I tell my students, and I'm sure you do as well, like, you do well to think of ideology not as like the content of what you think. Like, I think that capitalism is ideal and it delivers happiness wherever it goes. That's a kind of ideology. A much more difficult ideology is to think of ideology as what you have to think with, as the thing that super saturates your conceptual idioms. And it seems to me that that is, if you think of secularism, as I try to do, as like the totalizing, encompassing metaphysical scheme proper to liberalism in its imperial mode, that gives you something of the challenge of secularism. To try to think outside of secular presumption is difficult because so many of the most useful categories for us, race and sex among them, come freighted with the inbuilt presumptions proper to, say, the secularization thesis. That was really, again, I will just say, trying to think to the edges of such an edifice was one of the pleasures of the endeavor of the book, you know? And one of the pleasures of trying to think with a figure like Smith, who is so heterodox, who is so difficult to force into a single frame. And that, watching that happen in a variety of trains was just, I don't know, spent a couple of years feeling intellectually exhilarated by it.
I would really like to have you summarize for us what it is you take the secular to be. You just mentioned it's hard to kind of get under it or get beneath it. But what do you take the secular to be? Because it's this kind of, again, it's this hard thing to define. It's contested in theoretical literature, right? And then there's also this other problem of the secularization thesis. What's the secularization thesis? And then finally, not to stack too many questions on here for you, but finally, why does it need to be critiqued?
Yeah.
That's the whole burden of the book, right? Yeah.
Great. We can do this. We could have, I have my elevator speech about this, right? So we're used to thinking about the secular as one of the great gifts of modernity, right? Where there had been superstition and atavism and backwardness, there came the brightness of Enlightenment reason. And while there may have been sad things about that, the disenchantment of the world, et cetera, nevertheless, it was a cure for superstition. It made us rational, it made us charitable, and indeed allowed us, as Enlightenment thinkers would say, to achieve our full humanness. This would be, again, part of the story that modernity likes to tell itself about itself. Modernity's alibi for itself as well. Secularism is great, where there had been eschatological wars before. Now we have reason, debate, stuff like that. And it's Charles Taylor's point long ago that that's not a credible story. That not only because there has been no numerical diminishment in a quantity of religiosity over the course of the last 500 years, but rather because, like, religiosity has exploded and it's gotten a new sort of gravity to it. So part of what one might want to say, if one were, say, me or following Talal Assad, is that secularism is actually not a conceptual environment or a sociality that sees to the diminishment of religion at all. Not at all. Secular modernity has not seen to the, just look around. That would be a sort of lunatic proposition. Rather, what's crucial to a regime of secularism is the parsing of good religion from its opposite, from malign religion, from what I call in the book bad belief. That is to say, there are those religions which accord with the accumulating norms of a solidifying, essentially liberal sociality. Norms about family life, norms about rationality, norms about proper belief, norms about embodiment in self, norms about sociality, norms about the relation between belief and governmentality, between private devotion and citizenship. All those orchestrated norms. Religion, under the lights of secularism, are those things that accord with and do not too strenuously disrupt those set of norms. However, those belief practices that do not accord with that orchestrated set of norms about bodily practices, about beliefs in gender, about relation to the state, those don't really count as religions at all under the regime of secularism. They count as faulty belief, bad belief, heresy, or better still, zealotry, or in the racializing idioms of today, fundamentalism or radical fundamentalism. These mean to name bad religions, forms of bad belief. That, it seems to me, is an essential thing to recognize about secularism, that it propagates a distinction not between the religious and the non-religious. Religion flourishes in the secular age, but between those religions that do accord with the presumptively beneficent norms of liberal sociality, and therefore get to count as religions, and those that do not. And those that do not really count as religions, but as religious perversions, as derangements of the divine spark of devotionality in us that are themselves perverting and racializing, et cetera, et cetera. So all that way of describing secularism is to say it's a kind of discipline. It pays to think of secularism not as the thing that diminishes or derogates religion in public life, but as the thing that divides good religion from bad belief.
What do we gain and what do we lose if we say that the term secularism itself is a misdirection that allows us not to see Protestantism? That secularism, what again do we lose? And what do we gain if we just simply say Protestantism is this?
Kathleen, that's a fantastic question. I think to answer on the backside is that secularism, in part because of its project of relentless, though never full inclusivity, we lose the ways that a variety of religious practices become secularized. So think of the great post-war moment where suddenly Judaism, which had been the enemy of Christians in a lot of ways, becomes folded into a thing invented as the Judeo-Christian tradition, right?
Right, but that what I'm suggesting is historically grounding this. What do we lose? What do we gain? If we see that as a discrete set of persons, ideas that could be 16th century Protestantism. And we're just downstream from 16th century Protestantism in its imperialism, in its dogmatics, in its non-dogmatic dogmatics, and it has it achieves a particular force in the American democratic experience that was a Protestant experience.
Mm-hmm. I think you name precisely what we gain, which is a better purchase, and I think Hickman is great on this, on the imperialization of Christianity and the Christianization of imperialism, all of which are routed through Protestantism.
Or the imperialism of Christianity itself by Protestantism.
Yes, yeah. This is, I would say this is what we gain. I'd say the danger of it, however, is that to that, what's the phrase, the non-specific Protestantism? The non-specific Protestantism grows more and more non-specific in its imperializing venture. And so it seems to me that just naming it Protestantism loses the ways that a variety, like a hectic multiplicity of faith practices can be folded into its ambit without being quite the same as or quite reducible to its own Protestant origin. Though I think you're totally right about it still being downstream from it, in its particularly in its imperial mode.
Is not this your characterization a moment ago? Isn't that what we struggle with evangelicalism?
Oh, in certain ways, right? Like even.
Now I'm asking you as someone trained in a different discipline. So forgive me, but I think you have an insight for those of us who do study religion. I guess my concern is that those of us who study religion, when we study secularism, are missing the religion in secularism, notwithstanding the fact that the post-secular critique is adamant that secularism is a form of religious discourse. Notwithstanding that, but that we as religious studies people, when we embrace this post-secular critique conceptualization, this conceptualization of what, how we're thinking about this, that we somehow lose religion itself when we make the post-secular critique.
Right. Well, for me, and this again is, I have no standing in this other than as the person with my own training. For me, I would not venture the claim that like secularism is itself a religion. I would say that secularism, which we can put to its inaugural moment around the same time as colonial venture, is the thing that makes religion appear as such, as its own other. So there would not be, I could not name, I'm always being asked, like, I could not say there is no essence that will be religion that can be produced as religion. But secularism is a great machinery for producing the distinction that allows us then to name this thing.
And I would say that's the very thing that arguably causes us to lose the notion of religion itself. How you just phrased it, religion disappears in at that moment when we make that move that secularism is defined. Secularism is that which allows us to isolate something as religious, as illuminating, and believe me, I sincerely say as illuminating as this post-secular critique is. At some moment, I feel that we lose the phenomenon at issue. And of course, this is the Hall of Mirrors. That's what post-secularism says. I mean, that's the post-secularism critique itself. That's what secularism does.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess one of the things it seems that secularism does is try to get you to believe that there is a thing itself called religion. But I think as historians or as critical historians, we might say there are a set of practices that have been nominated for a multiplicity of purposes and intentions as religion that we might want to study in that grain and to see what they do and do not mobilize. But I am heartened by what secularism gave to me, which is like, there is no essence of a belief, a person, a practice, anything that you could do. That's what religion is. It has this deep thing. And that was an incredibly salutary turn for me. And it made me think, this is something that we can think of along with something like the history of sexuality. Though, again, like the history of sexuality, I think that enjoins us to a kind of historical work, that it would be important that not only that secularism named this thing as religion, but that for people inside it, that denomination had meaning and consequence that they then wanted to mobilize in particular ways that made it different from other kinds of mobilizations. And that, like, just as you say, working that through in the sort of Hall of Mirrors can be really tricky, especially because there's bad faith all around, like there are just bad faith dismissals that happen everywhere. I mean, I will say that going back to Stephen's question before, one of the ways that I got really interested in writing about Joseph Smith is because I found so dissatisfying either the inclination to insist on he found the plates, period, or the debunking imperative. Like those seemed like such terrible options, especially as a person, like I read Whitman all the time. Whitman was my first guy. I don't read Whitman to say like, did he really sleep with those men he said he sleeps with? That's like a lunatic presumption. And watching that happen to Smith in so many different contexts made me think that that my own sort of small, like secularism with queer studies might have something to say even about this practice of religion, which I had to catch up on conceptually. That's a sort of long-winded answer.
Well, and in a certain way, it's almost because of the, I guess you might say, the genetic secularity, as Jared Hickman puts it, of Mormonism's historical moment and self-framing that continues to motivate this kind of questioning.
Utterly believe that's correct, in part because early Mormonism was, it seemed to me, and this would be my claim, so ill-fitted to the secular disciplining of the liberal world into which it was being born, that it was immediately appeared mantled not only in racialized perversion, but fraud, but deceitfulness, but like had all of the hallmarks of bad belief. And that sort of never left it behind, that sort of a trailing indicator for forever, so that people, well, he was probably just fraudulent, you know?
Does that get us closer to a definition of something here that we would call religious in Mormonism? That it cannot be consumed by secularism somehow, because you could say that it still remains the definition of fraud, right?
I mean, that would be, I just wouldn't want to necessarily name that religion, because I can think of a lot of practices that refuse to be assimilated to the secular liberal discipline that would not nominate themselves as religions exactly, though one might fully say they have styles of devotion, they have styles of bodily intensity and stuff like that. But that I can tell you.
Styles of devotion and styles of bodily intensity, but they wouldn't
nominate themselves as religious.
Nominate themselves as religious.
Yeah.
For example, and I think this gets us back to your work.
Yeah, multitude of sex practices, right? Queer practice, I can think queer worlds.
Yeah, 19th century parties, right?
Yeah, and 20th century parties, sure. Like those would just be one example, but you do get to what was for me, and Kathleen, I know we talked about this when we met that one time, like finding out how a field of visions of embodiment, Smith's theorization of carnal life was constantly breathtaking, like the ideas. Okay, partially it began with as simple as like, what is polygamy? Why do, like, if you're building a religion, you want it to survive, why commit to this practice that everyone is going to despise? You're going to be racialized. You're going to get yourself murdered. Why?
Say more about that, Pete. Talk about that.
Yeah, and then will confess that I was not helped very much in a lot of the critical archive, which was either again debunking these are just sex-maddened clerics, basically, nor by the sort of more legitimating, no, it was really just family. Like, no, man, it was not really just family. There were lots of ways to be really just family. This was not that.
Or it was just God, right?
It was just God. So like what I was amazed by, and I know she's a contentious figure, but Fawn Brody really brought this to me, was that Smith was a person who was fascinated by pleasure. And he was trying to convince, like, at the center of Mormonism, the drama of exaltation, that persons are embryonic gods. And again you find in his work that the pathway to the realization of that sort of mind-shattering fact that one is oneself a god in embryo was carnal life, was the deranging pleasures of the body, was the illegibility of one's own carnal existence to oneself. That was a pathway to exaltation, in which case polygamy makes a variety of kinds of sense as a piece of cosmology that then has to be enacted, and it gets complicated in all those ways. But I tell you both, that was astounding. That was astounding to me, both for itself, because it set him in dialogue with figures I'm much more familiar with, Whitman only one of them. Astounding because, like other figures I thought about in the 19th century, it was a vision of carnal life that did not accord with the taxonomies that would later arrive and harden, homo and heterosexuality being among them, but also because it seemed to me so rigorously displaced in both attacks and defenses of Mormonism. And that was a thing I really wanted, just really wanted to make a case for, because I was amazed by it.
This what you're talking about, this carnality, or what you also call the radiant body of early Mormonism, it really plays into the kinds of theoretical work that you're doing here, namely trying to show how the racialized sexuality, or how the categories of race and sex that we would normally use in secular critique are being disrupted in the ways that Mormons live in their bodies and live through their racialized sexuality. It gets you to this concept that you call the racialized theodicy of hegemonic liberalism. And we should get to that in a moment, but I want you to say more about a couple of things, sort of, this radiant body of early Mormonism. And then we have the paradoxical racialization of Mormons, right? Where they're being racialized as racial others. They're not white, which may sound very strange to some of our listeners. And at the same time, they're participating in this settler colonist project of what we would today call white supremacy. right? So how are these categories of race and sex being disrupted, and what does that do for us?
Right. Short version of answering that beautifully turned question, right? It's actually not a surprise that the Mormons were racialized again and again and again as Mohammedan, as Asiatic, as Sultan-like, as African-like, and as, again, repeatedly for a variety of reasons we could talk about, Indian-like. Makes sense, again, if you follow a belief practice that sets itself so vigorously and cheerfully askant the environing norms of the liberal order that you live in, you will find yourself racialized. So it's not just that like bad belief makes you bad, sex makes you bad race, but that these things ratify one another. They understood themselves, or a variety of Mormons understood themselves, Brigham Young among them, as entitled to the permissions of the racial state. And having been wrongly and falsely denied them, they indeed identify with the entitlements of the racial state, with the imperial entitlements of the racial state, which helps you begin to explain why, say, under Young, there's a re-insistence on the rigorous patriarchality of what had been an already patriarchal structure of society, as though to say, yes, we're polygamous like the native peoples, but unlike them, we're patriarchs. Unlike their backward acivilizational mode of sociality, which does not know the difference between genders, we do know the difference between genders. And as the contemporary anthropologists tell us, that's the mark of our civilization. That's the hallmark of our civilizational whiteness. It helps explain why it would be so curiously important to Young in something like Acts of Service to say, Negroes shall not rule us, to insist that Mormonism and priesthood was for white people only. It was an act of identification with the orders of the racial state, despite the fact that the racial state at that time didn't want anything to do with Mormonism, didn't want anything to do with these racialized perverts who were being polygamous. And they would indeed not have anything to do with the Mormons until such time as they renounced polygamy. And the Mormons, this is why the conceptual grammar of homonationalism, which comes from the great work of Jesbert War, is so, so crucial to me. That seems to me the Mormons are an early iteration of a people marked out as perverse and as racialized in that perversion, who wish to gain entree into the orders of the racial state and who will protest that they belong in that racial state, despite the fact that for a long time the racial state will have nothing to do with them. So that would be my long answer.
Well, of course, this is complicated and reinforced by their sort of theology of the state, which is that we are the true America, right? And B, by their theology of racial redemption in the Book of Mormon, which sort of leads to this project of racial redemption where Brigham Young is saying, yeah, go, Mormon men, go marry Native women so that you can bring them into the fold of redeemed whiteness, right?
Complicated, and I will defer here to other. I have a reading of the Book of Mormon, but it's really informed by other people's reading. Jared's perhaps most among them. Like, there is a way of reading the Book of Mormon quite contrary to this, that actually reads the Book of Mormon as like a story of white imperialists who can do anything, literally anything, but think of themselves as white imperialists, as people who are waging war on the Lamanites unjustly, and whose pride and self-exaltation God sees fit to punish. Like, the Lamanites win the race war, and that sort of counter version of Mormon studies as like the Book of Mormon, rather, as a book about the false and damning pretense of white empire. That was a reading that was very available to mid-century Mormons who thought of the United States as the white empire that was proving itself fallen by driving them out, and indeed by driving out the native peoples with whom they had such a fractious, shifting set of alliances in the mid-century, as I think Jared Farmer's book, among others, traces out really so well.
Well, and of course, as one of our earlier guests this year, Christopher Blythe's book, Terrible Revolution, lays out, yeah, Latter-day Saints throughout the latter part of the 19th century, certainly, but even dating back to 1831, are expecting from the very beginning in their project of building Zion, the city of Zion, New Jerusalem in Missouri, they're expecting Native Americans to build the New Jerusalem, right? Like they're,
Yeah.
they
Yeah, the redeemed Lamanites. Yeah.
exactly. And so, so very complicated. And we could certainly spend a huge amount of time on that, and we don't have the time to do that. But Kathleen, go ahead.
I know you don't have the time to do that. Can I just? I'm going to extend it if you don't mind. Just one more question. So you have these two options to look at Mormons and how they fit in a narrative of race and supremacy and territory and dominion and all of that. And the one is arguably, and a very strong argument, as you put it in your book, that Latter-day Saints realize their true selves redeemed by these Lamanite peoples. Then they have the frontier experience with its complexities, right? But then you have this other narrative of how, the Mormons are just trying to be white because that's where they find their safety as well. So they double down on race. So what does it say about whoever chooses? Those are two very contrary explanations for race and Mormonism. How do you choose between them?
I'm not sure I see how exactly they're contrary. I can imagine the Mormons as like fired by the possibility of racial redemption. And then like as I keep saying when I teach this to my students, like the fact of their being subject to what Foucault calls many forms of indirect murder, it's not imaginary. Like the state is coming for them. And one could say that in their very identification with Native peoples, they see in letters of blood and fire what it looks like to oppose with a religion that will not be made secular, the United States. Right? They watch the absolute decimation of Native peoples in the West, and particularly Native peoples' decimation in the name of religious purification. Like through their very identification or proximity to Native peoples, at least, identification may be the wrong word, they see written out for them what it might mean to fail at being secular. So the choice of whiteness would not be totally voluntary, is what I mean.
So the two ways of talking about racism and Mormonism require observing historical change. They have to be embedded in the historical experience of these people, and you can't just leave it at a level of reading a particular narrative of race into their thought.
Say that's not, I think one does that well, neither in an exonerating way. I'm not moved by like, they were just racist like other people in the 19th century. No, man, their relation to Native people was not just like other people in the 19th century. It was spectacularly fraught and crossed with all these complicated identifications. Neither will it do to say, they were just imperial white supremacists like everybody before them. Like, well, in certain senses, yeah, they were also wars were waged upon them. So if they weren't, they were gonna be so, because they were not fools. They recognized the only forms of sovereignty that were available to them, and what they wanted was like the protections of sovereignty, were through an affiliation with the white racial state, which is something they could do, making them tremendously different from, say, the Native people.
No, I've always thought that the discussion of this history even omits that these states by Young are made while they're trying to get statehood, and while the South is negotiating as well.
Of course, and for me, Kathleen, I think that's very right. And for me, the renunciation of polygamy, I think, is well thought in relation to like the absolute decimation of Native peoples in the West, like the militarized, bloody, genocidal decimation of Native peoples, which, as people like Lewis Warren and other people understand, is like it's a religious campaign.
Yeah, the Dawes Act was in 1890. Does that ring a bell? With the manifesto, right? The Mormon manifesto, and
the massacre at Wounded Knee, which again, people think that the Mormons had something to do with the ghost dance, of course, which precipitates all these massacres. Like the Mormons are deeply involved in that. So like the degree of state violence entailed in the maintenance and expansion of the racial state really isn't not a particularly venerable thing about the Mormons, that they hurry for shelter inside the racial state. It's precisely a discipline, like they are disciplined at the real threat of murder into these new bearings about themselves. So that's how I take your point about like both historical emplotment and change over time. You know.
Thanks, Pete. That is I think that's a great summary. Thank you both for that. Before we sort of sum up, there's a really critical theoretical concept that we haven't talked about yet fully, and it's really crucial to your conclusion, and that is Foucault's idea of biopolitics. So I wonder if you could say more about biopolitics and then help us understand. Of course, that could be like a 20-hour podcast, right?
Man, you're landing. You're hitting me. You're hitting all my stump speeches. You gotta, I got all my little elevator speech. Sure. Biopolitics is a way of understanding two things at once, like how powers simultaneously look to discipline individual bodies. Sexuality is one important thing of this, to make them better compliant with the necessities of, say, work in a variety of forms. And also how powers located in the state and around the state, so extra state powers as well, think about populations, think about persons in great aggregate, and try to tune them in relation to one another to produce a kind of homeostasis. And some of those populations are going to be made to flourish, going to be part of the circulation and flourishing of life. And some of those are going to be let to die, or going to be exposed to larger probabilities of death. That is a very shorthand, that's Ruth Wilson Gilmore's shorthand definition of what we might mean by race, like differential exposure to probabilities of death and harm. And for Foucault, this is, of course, make, live, let die, the essentials of biopower. It helps us think about how populations get aggregated into things like races. Biopolitics is a conceptual framework that allows you to think about racialization rather than say there was this race and there was this race. But there were groups of people who were understood as populations and who are optimized as populations through the mechanics of racialization. So it's a way of thinking about both in simultaneously a variety of things about how compartments of the body like sexuality become folded into the becoming population of particular groups of people, and what racialization does to those populations and how these things speak back to one another, and what all of them have to do with larger structures of power like, say, empire, or like, say, liberalizing capital. That would be the very short, and I apologize, too abstract way of talking about it. And I would say that the good place to go is Foucault's lectures from The Society Must Be Defended, The Birth of Biopolitics, Security, Territory, Population, rather than, or as addendums to books like Discipline and Punish and The History of Sexuality. And that was, of course, very important to me to think about the Mormons and the processes of racialization. It was important, too, to think about how the regime of secularism that we've been trying to describe can be racializing, the way that misfiring devotion can name out a population and racialize them, that is to say, expose them to larger probabilities of death. And that seemed to me super important to think about. And it helped me reorder our sense of what like both race and sex might mean as these categories that would actually be heavy with relations to devotionality in ways that are rather more secularized understanding of them can misplace.
Well, and of course, one of the really striking consequences of the secular biopolitics in the United States is what you call the desecularization of the racialized body, right? And so this is what happens with Mormonism initially. Of course, with Mormon Americanization, the Mormons are, as we've talked about, they're enfolded into the racial state more fully.
More fully, but not completely. And I would again defer to Kathleen, whose work helps clarify this tremendously. Like that enfolding is neither complete nor entirely secure. I could take this too as a point about Protestantism. Like the Mormons, the fact of having once been marked out in their history as racialized deviants perverted by misfiring devotion has not vanished from Mormonism. And in fact, as it seems to me, a live undercurrent in its own dispositions toward things like gender and sex, which it needs to work out again and again and again in a process that has no real end point. And the point of which, and I would really want to say that the point for me of post-secular critique is not that therefore we have nothing to say about religion, that we have therefore no critique about the practices of a given religion. That's not the point at all. Neither is it to say that where the secular is always malignancy. Neither is that the point. It is rather to think of these terms as like in constant negotiation over what the terms of modernity shall be.
But there is a moral judgment inherent in these conversations, it seems to me.
I mean, there's certainly, for me, there certainly is, though, that I would like to think that that moral judgment doesn't simplify. Like, I would name secularism as an order of discipline that produces races, and by producing races, produces differentiated proximities of life and death. And it does that in part by inclusion. Like, as I said to a group recently, like, you do well to think of secular liberalism as a two-fisted machine, a two-fisted engine. One of the things it does is exploit, like exploit, extract. The other thing it does is include. Inclusion and exploitation go together. And because those things go together, moral cases about them are never going to be simple and never going to be flat. I am the last person who's going to say like, oh, when the Mormons now try to be more inclusive toward queer people, which they do haltingly and stuff like that, that's merely their obedience to the dictates of secular belonging. Well, no, it is their dictates to the disciplines of secular belonging, but that doesn't make it a malignant thing. That makes that seems to me like one would have to make a much more particularized local judgment about those things. Though one would also not want to lose the larger picture of Mormonism's constant struggle with the defining terms of secular liberalism.
As you were speaking about this process of unfolding that always leaves a remainder, and that remainder is always potentially in tension with hegemonic liberalism and the secular, it made me think about a metaphor for thinking about this, which is the Hegelian dialectic, right? The Hegelian dialectic is precisely what this is, right? Where, the so-called synthesis never, when it sublates, if you like that translation, when it sublates the negative, its opposite, or its the absence of its positivity, I guess, it never fully, it's always in combat. That struggle never necessarily goes away, although one thing sort of wins out in the hierarchy.
I think that, Stephen, my own version of, and I would, thank all my Marxist friends who made me a better Marxist than I would have been otherwise, is like, all things are pregnant with their negation. That's part of what dialectics means. Like, all things are pregnant with their negation. And those negations need to be worked out historically, in real time. They cannot be solved on paper. But the actual irreducible antagonism of actual historical living does not permit us that. And I've always found that very, very heartening.
So Joseph Smith will write, there is opposition in, not just between, all things.
That's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. It's so good. It's just so good.
No, it's right there. Yeah, it's one of the more interesting ontological statements in the Book of Mormon.
Truly. There's, like a faith committed to its dialecticism. That's not a usual thing. That's just not a usual thing.
So, Pete, Kathleen, thank you so much for chatting with us today. Pete, before we go, I'm sure our listeners would love to hear any book recommendations that you may have, and feel free to be as self-promoting as possible. I know you have Vineland just came out this year, so tell us what you're reading and what you're currently working on.
Just very, very quickly, as you can tell from here, we're talking to people like Kyla Schuler and the Biopolitics of Feeling, and Jasbir Puar's work has been very important to me. Eve Sedgwick, Hortense Spiller's W.B. Du Bois has been very important to me. Jared Hickman's work, Priya Gopal's work, all that stuff has been really fomenting for trying to think. I'm trying to write a book now called After Ahab, Tyranny in the Wake of the Age of Revolutions, which is trying to think about what tyranny looks like under how one conceptualizes tyranny in a world from which kings and queens have not exactly been banished but diminished. That's what I'm trying to go next, and Melville will help me do that. I would want to say, and I hope you'll permit me to say before I leave, that the last year has been a real delighting sort of adventure, because as Kathleen knows, and Stephen, you know too, I'm not a religious historian, and I'm not a person really in Mormon studies, and I've been treated with such generous hospitality, and that's just meant a very, very great deal to me. You know, that a book like this, which would have an oblique relation to a field like Mormon studies, would be discussed with, again, such openness, and like a willingness to be critical and non-dismissive. That's just meant a very great deal to me. Taylor Petrie has helped me with that. Ben Park. I've felt very heartened by that, and this podcast is an exemplification of what I've felt. So thank you for that, truly.
Well, thank you for being with us here today. It's been fantastic. I'm a huge fan of this book. This is my second reading, and I anticipate reading it more times. So again, thank you. Really appreciate your time.
Stephen, that's truly the highest praise. You know, you put something in the world and hope that it can be made so that someone else can make use of it somehow or other. So I appreciate that tremendously.
I'm shocked to hear you refer to your work as obliquely related to Mormon studies. I am truly shocked by that, and I would put it really at the heart of what people who do Mormon studies ought to be reading. So,
oh, Kathleen, that's very, very, very kind of you. I mean, I get it. It's not like it's not history. It's like intellectual history, right? So that means it follows different protocols. It's interested in a different set of questions. And that's people have noted, like, this is a literary scholar's book, not a historian's book. And I'm sort of like, that is 100% correct. But it requires of people who are not like that interested in theory or that interested in intellectual history rather than a different kind of material history. It requires a lot of patience, and it requires a lot of non-dismissive generosity. And I've been really moved by, like Ben wrote the first thing about it, and like, we're very different sort of writers, you know what I mean? Like, he's a religious historian who specializes in Mormonism. I'm like a queer theory person. And his engagement was really just so heartening. Like, we disagree about stuff, of course, but it was disagreement in the key of like, wow, that's cool, you know?
That's Peter Coviello and Kathleen Flake. We've been chatting about Dr. Coviello's recent book, Make Yourselves Gods, Mormons and the Unfinished Business of American Secularism, available from the University of Chicago Press. You've been listening to Scholars and Saints. Today we talked about secularism and its connection with settler colonialism. Secularism, it seems, is shorthand for the ways that the nation-state disciplines or orders and controls people's bodies. It puts them in categories like race, sexuality, good religion, and bad belief. Peter Coviello argues that Mormonism resists this secular ordering. Joseph Smith's theology of humans becoming gods was tied to ideas about race and sexuality that resist the neat taxonomies of biopolitics. Maybe, Coviello says, it gives us a glimpse of what it means to think outside the secular. Next time on Scholars and Saints, join me as I chat with Dr. Condon Smith Hansen about his book, Frontier Religion, Mormons and America, 1857 to 1907. Support for Scholars and Saints comes from the Mormon Studies program at the University of Virginia. Music is provided by Ben Howington. To hear more, visit mormonguitar.com.